Ah, the Victorian era, an age of gas lamps, corsets, and the cheery sound of distant coughing from tuberculosis. It was a time when one's table manners were more important than one's emotions, and when you could die from a paper cut or shame, whichever arrived first. Romance existed, certainly, but it wore a bonnet, spoke in coded glances, and never removed its gloves. And yet, for all the frills and restraint, there was one deeply bewildering event that struck fear into even the most pious and well-mannered of newlyweds: the wedding night. You see, in modern times, the wedding night is depicted as a candlelit culmination of affection, a symphony of petals and Barry White. But in Victorian England, it was often about as romantic as a root canal, performed in a drafty manner with a portrait of Queen Victoria watching. The terror stemmed less from the act itself, and more from the thundering silence surrounding it. Proper Victorian courtship was an elaborate game of "Odds don't touch me." A gentleman might write dozens of florid letters, each pledging eternal devotion, yet never once daring to mention a feeling located below the ribcage. Courtship was performed in parlours, under supervision, and often with enough chaperones to rival a minor military campaign. Physical contact was limited to the occasional gloved handshake, and perhaps, if adrenaline ran high, a mutual gaze sustained for longer than 3 seconds. Sex education, as you might imagine, was not exactly part of the national curriculum. It existed in a hazy realm somewhere between folklore, medical quackery, and terrifying warnings about moral degeneration. Girls were taught nothing at all, unless wide-eyed whispers and the occasional scarring metaphor counted as preparation. On your wedding night, a young bride might be told by her aunt, "You must simply lie back, think of England, and be brave." What happened next may or may not be love, but bravery, absolutely mandatory. For men, things weren't exactly clearer. They might have been sent to boarding school, where they picked up cryptic rumors from other frightened boys, or perhaps had access to a medical journal or two, which, during this period, was still diagnosing hysteria by recommending leeches and gentle scolding. One popular marital guide from 1861, titled The Wedding Night, advised that the husband should be gentle, patient, and, if possible, understanding of his new wife's extreme ignorance. It then proceeded to explain the process with less clarity than a fog-heavy London morning. The result was a first night of marriage so fraught with mystery, embarrassment, and sheer logistical confusion that many couples spent it in separate beds, sometimes even separate houses. But what really sealed the fear wasn't just the lack of information, it was the weight of expectation. Victorian society treated the marital bed not as a private matter, but as a milestone of national importance. Pajamas had barely been invented, yet everyone seemed to be watching. A bride, raised under the strict ice cream scoop of morality, might find herself marched from the grandeur of her wedding reception past teary-eyed relatives and into a silent chamber where the wallpaper matched the anxiety. And there, under a tower of starched linens, two strangers, legally bound but emotionally miles apart, were expected to suddenly unravel decades of innocence and produce either a child or at least some vaguely documented affection. It was, in many ways, the most awkward team-building exercise imaginable. Now, of course, not every couple floundered. Some managed to muddle through with laughter and affection, much like one might approach a tricky soufflé recipe. Others grew close over time, discovering love like a misplaced button, unexpected, a bit odd but comforting once found. Still, the first night remained a yawning chasm for many, a place where idealism met reality, where lace met linen, and where no one quite knew whether to say good night, amen, or I'm sorry. Some households even enlisted the services of a brideswoman, a cheerful but unnerving woman who might hover nearby, ready with tea, advice, or in extreme cases, direct instructions. In certain aristocratic circles, the bedding ceremony involved witnesses. Yes, actual live witnesses, to ensure the marriage was properly consummated. Nothing sets the mood quite like your in-laws loitering with candles. And so it wasn't merely the mystery, or even the morality. It was the performance of it, the hushed anticipation, the way they all held their breath, as if a couple might emerge at dawn 2 inches closer, or 50 feet apart. So tonight, we've peeked through the velvet curtains of the Victorian wedding chamber, an elegant, bewildered space where the unknown loomed large and conversation remained modest, even when things became decidedly immodest. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Curl in deeper, and I'll tell you what came next. The year is 1851. Queen Victoria is firmly settled on the throne. Corsets are cinched tighter than the grip of a disapproving aunt, and wedding cakes are so dense they might legally qualify as construction materials. But beneath the lace-trimmed surface of nuptial bliss lies an unspoken terror, one that loomed large in the dim, candlelit corners of every newlywed psyche. You see, in Victorian England, weddings were lovely. The parties, splendid. The dresses, lavish. Although you'd better hope you didn't faint from the cinching. But the wedding night, that was not the rosy, romantic affair of modern honeymoon brochures. No, it was more closely akin to a medical procedure performed in complete darkness by 2 individuals with no training, no guidance, and a palpable sense of dread. Imagine, for a moment, you're a 19-year-old bride, your hair coiffed, your eyes wide, and your thoughts filled with absolutely nothing helpful. Your mother, up to now, has offered exactly 0 practical information about what comes next. Instead, she passed down some cryptic wisdom involving flowers, duty, and the importance of bearing sons with robust sideburns. Sex education in this era was less education and more a genre of historical fantasy riddled with euphemisms. The closest thing to a talk you might receive was a cryptic reference to a wife's obligation, whispered just before the bouquet toss and followed by a melancholic sigh. On the groom's end, things were no better. Gentlemen were encouraged to arrive on the wedding night, having never so much as glimpsed a lady's ankle, lest their eyes spontaneously combust with impure thoughts. Instead, young men were handed an anatomy textbook edited within an inch of accuracy, and perhaps a knowing wink from an uncle who'd spent too much time in colonial outposts. In many cases, these young men weren't merely nervous, they were petrified. How did one even begin? Where was everything supposed to go? In a world where table legs were considered too risque to display without frilly coverings, figuring out how 2 humans fit together was akin to assembling IKEA furniture in the dark, except no Allen wrench could fix wounded dignity. The tension erupted in absurd etiquette guides. There were entire pamphlets dedicated to ensuring that no one, under any circumstance, engaged in enthusiasm. Passion, after all, was French. Instead, a successful Victorian wedding night was one in which the bride didn't cry too much, the groom didn't faint, and no one brought shame upon the family by enjoying themselves. But the real culprit behind all this terror was the enormous, looming presence of purity culture. Virginal innocence wasn't just an ideal, it was a brand. Brides were expected to drift down the aisle, wrapped in innocence like a marshmallow in a lace doily, untouched not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, and possibly spiritually by the merest whiff of earthy desire. This level of pressure turned the bedroom into a stage where 2 trembling performers were expected to deliver the delicate choreography of an act they had never rehearsed or even seen. Mea culpa if it all ended in tears, awkward apologies, and a long sigh toward the ceiling plasterwork. And we'll say nothing yet of the furniture involved. A proper Victorian marital bed was not conducive to improvisation. It usually involved multiple layers of stuffing, creaking mahogany, and at least 1 doily too, near the action. It was not a setting for agile exploration. It was better suited for lying rigidly still and pretending one was asleep, even if the effort to produce airs was technically ongoing. Naturally, misunderstandings abounded. There are documented cases, real ones, of couples remaining chaste for years, not because they were particularly devout, but simply because no one was sure how to proceed. Husbands would sleep fully clothed out of modesty. Wives would draw the curtains tight around the marriage bed, and both parties would silently hope the stork showed up anyway, perhaps out of pity. Eventually, some brave souls sought assistance, discreet books, moral instruction manuals, or in one earnest case, the local vicar. Historians agree that went poorly. And so, behind the gilt-framed wedding portraits and the pressed white gloves lies a castle of fear, creaking under the weight of its silence. Not hatred, not rejection, just confusion. As the gas lights dimmed and London turned quietly beneath its soot-laced skies, the wedding night mysteries lingered unsolved, humming through the lace curtains like a minor key waltz. All of which, perhaps, explains why some preferred elopement with scandal to matrimony with an instruction manual, printed in Latin. In the next hush of our tale, we'll peek into the peculiar role of the bridal chamber witness. Yes, really. And why Victorian family members brought a whole new meaning to hovering awkwardly. As twilight settled over Victorian England like the gentle turning of a lacy doily over a lampshade, a curious anxiety floated through the air for newlyweds. It wasn't the distant worry of finances or the long-term logistics of sharing a chamber pot. No, it was something far more immediate, terrifying, and, in hindsight, delightfully absurd. The wedding night. Modern ears may assume this involved candles, corsets, and hopeful fumbling. But instead of romance, anticipation, or even a trace of champagne-sparkled delight, many newly married Victorians approached the mysterious first night with the same energy one might summon when facing a wild animal with no idea where its teeth are. Why? Well, let's start with the silence. Victorian society, perhaps best described as a communal experiment in blushing, was bound by an elaborate code of etiquette and restraint. Discussions of passion, or anything below the neck really, were done with the same fervor and enthusiasm one might apply to reading wallpaper samples out loud. Men were warned not to gaze too long at ankles. Women were advised to think of swans. And any whisper of, conjugal matters was either shrouded in euphemism or entirely omitted, like a tomato seed politely skipped in a hungry gentleman's salad. This meant that a shocking number of brides arrived at their own wedding nights, not only unprepared, but absolutely unaware that anything even remotely undignified was about to occur. Imagine being handed a puzzle box with no instructions, then being told to solve it in the dark while pretending you've done so many times before. And also, it's your moral duty. Courtship, you see, was an extended performance of restraint. Suitors brought flowers, recited poetry, and if things got particularly racy, they might brush gloves during an outing in a well-lit park. Even engagements weren't necessarily a license for physical closeness. They were more of a polite agreement to eventually share pension plans. The average couple might have shared no more than a glance and a tea biscuit before wedding bells launched them into marital obligation. And those bells tolled ominously. The lack of practical education didn't help. Sex education in the Victorian era was like a secret society, exclusive, cryptic, and likely to involve incorrect diagrams. For young women of a certain class, there was often no formal instruction at all. If a bride was fortunate, she might receive a shivering warning from a flustered aunt during a carriage ride. Just remember, child, be brave, and it shan't last longer than a crumpet toast. If she was less lucky, she found out everything simultaneously in the flicker of gaslight and horror. Men, on the other hand, were assumed to know everything, which was a dreadful assumption, particularly as much of their knowledge came from rumour, poorly written pamphlets, and the sort of innuendo exchanged at all-boys schools between milky sandwiches and matches of cricket. One infamous so-called sex manual of the period suggested a man ought simply to proceed with the resolve of a master carpenter, which explains so very little and raises even more concerns about misplaced enthusiasm and poor interior design choices. Much of the fear surrounding wedding nights came from not just confusion, but also from the weight of Victorian expectations, purity, duty, and the terrifying medical nonsense believed at the time. Popular science of the day often treated female desire as a sort of tragic brain fever. Some doctors, true men of science with large mustaches and absolutely no shame, warned that women who enjoyed marital activities too much might risk womb migration, where the uterus, startled or perhaps simply wanderlusting, would drift around the body like a confused balloon. Others believed a strained wedding night, especially one involving excessive emotion, might render a woman permanently hysterical or sprain her modesty beyond repair. So while lace was delicately sewn and floral garlands hung in celebration, many newlyweds climbed into marital beds as if entering battle. Soft candlelight spilled over faces that hoped for romance but feared discomfort, shame, or, heaven forbid, permanent inner organ turmoil. But here's a gentle twist. There were some couples who discovered, amid the starched linens and fearful sobs, that affection could be learned, that fumbling could turn tender, that laughter was allowed. It didn't happen often enough, but in rare Victorian bedrooms, chuckles started to replace gasps, even if they came late. And now that we've settled into the dark velvet folds of a honeymoon suite in 1872, you might be wondering what exactly society did to try to fix this awkward, fearsome first encounter. Was help ever offered? Did anyone, aunt, author, or anxious pastor, dare to explain things properly? Well, that curious tale will gently unfold next. The Victorian parlour, a place of buttoned-up social intrigue, heavily upholstered furniture, and piano recitals that went on for just slightly too long. Now the parlour may seem an odd place to discuss wedding nights, but bear with me. You see, it was here, in these dimly lit sitting rooms flooded with doilies and decorative plates, that our trembling Victorian brides and their stiff-collared grooms first tiptoed toward a mystery far more terrifying than the ghost story read aloud after tea: marital intimacy. Let us float for a moment into the particular anxieties of the Victorian bride. Dressed in a suffocating white gown, white, of course, signifying purity and unintentionally ghost-like fear, she stood not only on the precipice of marriage but, more frightfully, biology. And in many cases, she knew as much about her own anatomy as she did about astrophysics. Sex education in this era could best be described as elusive. Mothers, in their infinite discretion, might pull their blushing daughters aside shortly before the wedding for a quiet talk under the guise of discussing popery or embroidery thread. These talks, however, were often less instructional and more vague foreshadowings of doom. "You'll understand when the time comes," mothers would whisper ominously, as though describing a Victorian prophecy rather than, well, human reproduction. And just like that, poor Florence or Edith found herself standing before a man she barely knew, often twice her age, always wearing too much pomade, about to embark on a journey that had been spoken of only in shadowy metaphors and avoided eye contact. It didn't help that the expectations surrounding wedding nights were painted with equal parts sanctity and sheer terror. A bride was meant to transform overnight from angelic innocent to satisfied missus, without the benefit of diagrams, explanations, or even a brief pamphlet. This would have been a challenging transition for anyone, but particularly so in a world where ankles were scandalous and table legs were sometimes draped to preserve modesty. Not to be outdone in confusion, grooms fared only mildly better. Boys' education might include vague Latin labels in a dusty biology primer, but interpersonal knowledge, such as how to effectively communicate with a panicked spouse, was not part of the curriculum. It was assumed that being men, they would simply know what to do. which, needless to say, was an assumption more fictional than the novels they refused to let their daughters read. So there they were, two humans in a heavily curtained bedroom, one in lace and nerves, the other with a waxed moustache and absolutely no emotional vocabulary. The result was often less an act of passion and more a hesitant, confused reenactment of things whispered in boarding school hallways or half read in medical books intended for a professional audience, not an amateur evening. This fog of ignorance even extended to the very logistics of wedding night accommodations. Some couples, too shy to address the matter aloud, would retire to entirely separate bedrooms after the ceremony, each assuming the other would know what to do next. A handful of these Victorian pairs reportedly went years, yes, years, before finally broaching the marital elephant in the room. If elephants composed of awkward silences and buttoned-up politeness could be said to exist, which, in Victorian England, they certainly could. But Victorian prudishness wasn't merely a matter of etiquette or personal awkwardness. It was policy. Books with anything approaching explicit content were swiftly banned, burned, or buried under euphemisms. Even medical advice concerning reproduction could be illegal if it was deemed obscene. This meant that doctors giving straightforward counsel about, say, where babies actually came from could face prosecution. One physician was famously imprisoned after publishing a book that used clinical words for female anatomy. Imagine serving time because you dared to point out where the uterus resides. The brides and grooms of the age did what they could, muddling their way through a labyrinth of inexperience and wordless expectation. Many grew to understand each other, eventually, but on their wedding nights. Those were often less scenes of romantic discovery and more like unintentional comedy sketches, which would be funny, if not so entirely enveloped in nerves, social pressure, and the eternal question, is this normal? And as the candlelight flickers low, and our couple lies side by side in emotional paralysis, barely touching fingertips beneath a mountain of hand-stitched quilts, we begin to understand why, for the Victorian newlywed, terror often edged out tenderness on that long-awaited first night. But the unwritten rules of Victorian intimacy didn't stop at silence. No, they evolved into rituals, prescriptions, and rather suspect solutions. And in the warm hush of our next unfolding moment, we'll find ourselves exploring how corsets, cucumbers, and cold water baths all featured in the strange prescriptions of Victorian marital life. By the flickering light of gas lamps and the rustle of taffeta skirts, the Victorian wedding was often a production of high drama and low expectations, but none so dramatic nor so bewildering as what came directly after. Because beneath the layers of lace, under the weight of social decorum and decorative antimacassars, lay a national case of collective blushes waiting to unfold, the mysteries of the wedding night. Now, you'd think that the end of a lavish ceremony, complete with horse-drawn carriages and distant relatives weeping into their cravats, would signal the beginning of something tender or at least amorous. But for many newlyweds in Victorian England, the wedding night was not so much an intimate affair as it was a trial by fire, or perhaps more accurately, by candlelight, with several confused attempts and a misguided copy of the Book of Household Management nearby, which, rather disappointingly, offered more wisdom on pickling cucumbers than on navigating one's spouse. This was thanks, in large part, to a culture that had cultivated an enormous silence around sex. Victorian society, with all its hems and hawed euphemisms, avoided the subject of intimacy like it was an uninvited aunt with scandalous opinions. Proper young ladies were expected to float down the aisle in a sort of intellectual haze, having undergone an upbringing thoroughly devoid of practical understanding. Questions like, what happens next? Do we talk about it? Should one bring marmalade? Were typically met with redirection, arc toward embroidery or, in dire cases, suggestions for a nice long feint. Men didn't fare much better, mind you. Some were primed with hushed warnings, passed down through older brothers or strategically dog-eared pages in questionable French literature. Others relied on boarding school myths, which ranged in accuracy from almost correct to please don't do that. Add to this the pressure of performance, the total absence of worked-out consent norms, and an unspoken cultural script that equated ignorance with virtue, and what you had was an evening ripe for discomfort, confusion, and the occasional medical intervention. But where did all this fear really come from? Some of it stemmed from the omnipresent spectre of reputation. Victorians prized chastity, particularly female chastity, like a rare collectible teacup, not to be touched, used, or even looked at for too long. And so the wedding night was often less a celebration and more a ceremonial unlocking of moral permissions, overseen silently by generations of ghosts and societal expectations. For many brides, there was no gentle preparation, no heartfelt conversation. It was a sort of metaphysical plunge, like being given the keys to a carriage one had never been taught to drive. There were horror stories whispered behind parlor doors, of women emerging the next morning pale and ill, of grooms panicking, fainting, or gamely consulting botanical guides for lack of better information. Some anecdotes suggest well-meaning mothers would drop vague hints in letters, such as, "Remember, your husband is now entitled to your affections. Be gracious, and God keep you." And one notorious 19th century guidebook advised brides to simply bear her husband's ardor with grace, a sentence that manages to be both infuriating and wholly unhelpful. Even where affection genuinely existed, expectation could be overwhelming. With no blueprint and no vocabulary for discussing needs or boundaries, couples often stumbled their way through their first night as though navigating a very delicate, very awkward dance with no music and far too many petticoats. Some delayed the inevitable out of mutual hesitation. Others, feeling the pressure, rushed headlong with all the delicacy of a runaway mail coach. Mistakes were made. Feelings were confused. And amid it all, physicians, those earnest, mustachioed figures with stethoscopes and severely parted hair, tried their best to advise on what they coyly referred to as marital relations. Medical manuals offered diagrams of alarming abstraction, moralizing lectures, and long paragraphs about the perils of excessive indulgence, which might lead, according to some, to anemia, melancholy, or an irreparable lack of vigor. For many Victorians, especially women, the wedding night loomed as both a rite of passage and a moment of peril. It was spoken of in hushed tones, anticipated with anxiety, and remembered with a mix of sorrow, relief, or, very occasionally, fondness. And it's no wonder, really, considering that decades of cultural prudishness had rendered the whole endeavor as mysterious as the far side of the moon, only with fewer maps and significantly more monogrammed nightgowns. Still, not every experience was a disaster. Some couples, through luck or laughter or sheer emotional resourcefulness, muddled their way through to something tender, but many more faced a long, slow road of figuring things out, with more courage than comprehension. As the firelight gently dims on our Victorian chamber, we leave bride and groom staring into the darkness, a little afraid, perhaps, but undeniably brave in their bewilderment. And softly ahead, we drift into a quieter hall of history, where secrets are whispered between lace curtains and footmen keep doorways. As the long shadows of Victorian sensibility tiptoed across the drawing room carpets, there existed a delicate dance between propriety and absurdity. The Victorians, God bless their earnest little waistcoats, spent an astonishing amount of time pretending that the very concept of intimacy hadn't occurred to them, ever. And yet, paradoxically, they talked about little else. In diaries, in conduct books, and occasionally through poorly concealed fan language, which brings us to one of the strangest tools in the Victorian bride's arsenal of non-communication, the matrimonial advice manual. You see, for many young women in the 19th century, marriage was like stepping through a mysterious mahogany door into the unknown. Only the door was locked, the keyhole glued shut, and no one dared explain what lay on the other side, except the occasional aunt or a hilariously vague book with a title like Hints for the New Wife, a guide to graceful wifery and domestic delights. Ah yes, the advice literature, a literary genre entirely dedicated to saying absolutely nothing while using an impressive number of lace-trimmed metaphors. These manuals promised enlightenment, but what they really offered was cryptic poetry that left brides more baffled than ever. Take, for example, the infamous guide, What a Young Wife Ought to Know, written by Dr. Mary Wood Allen in 1895. Now, Dr. Wood Allen genuinely believed she was performing a public service, which is adorable and slightly alarming. She advised young women to preserve their modesty, uphold morality, and, under no circumstances, dwell on curious desires. She stopped just shy of advising that couples should reproduce via polite correspondence and perhaps a firm handshake. Many of these books approached marital relations with the gravitas of a medical emergency. They warned of nervous shocks, womanly fatigue, and a phenomenon mysteriously termed the marital duty. The phrase alone sounded less like a romantic crescendo and more like something you'd perform with a clipboard and a sense of dread. On the bride's side, terror typically bloomed, somewhere between receiving such a book and untying her corset for the night. She wasn't just worried about the act itself, whatever precisely that was, but also what it meant for her immortal soul, her social standing, and whether she was about to be, as one author gravely warned, adrift on feminine uncertainties. Some advice books encouraged her to lie back, think of queen and country, and hope the ordeal would be over quickly, although occasionally it was enthusiastically emphasized that she must not enjoy herself too much. Joy, after all, was not entirely ladylike if it arrived unchaperoned. The grooms, meanwhile, were not exactly faring better. Victorian chaps, raised on the same diet of veiled morality, often approached the wedding chamber like they were investigating a haunted attic. Most had been handed medical tracts about male weaknesses and the frightful moral and physical consequences of being too enthusiastic in solitude. That sort of thing could allegedly lead to blindness, early death, or, for reasons still medically mysterious, a fondness for pianoforte music. Anxieties mounted on both sides with the grace of two cats attempting a waltz. What was supposed to be the beginning of a new life together frequently started with confusion, awkward silence, and someone tripping over a chamber pot. And then there were the euphemisms. Victorian advice books avoided any direct mention of body parts, actions, or indeed anything that might plausibly explain what would actually happen. Instead, they leaned into floral analogy with reckless abandon. Passion was a blossoming garden, the act itself a mutual tending of the vine. And if that left newlyweds wondering if they were supposed to exchange potted ferns all evening, well, that was on them, really. The result was a shared naivete so deep it could only be described as impressive. Picture two people bound by vows, layered in lace, desperately pretending. They knew what they were doing while secretly hoping the other one had read a clearer chapter. But before you despair for the newlyweds, remember this. The Victorians were nothing if not adaptable. Eventually, many figured things out, with time, whispering candles, and perhaps a confidential wink from an older maid. Still, beneath the velvet hush of wedding curtains, much confusion lingered. And in the next hush of history, we meet the curious concept of the wedding night faint, a phenomenon both baffling and absolutely real, brought on not by medical ailment, but the sheer shock of knowledge withheld too long in the shimmering half-light of a gaslit drawing room where the drapes are thick velvet and the air carries the faint scent of lavender sachets and boiled cabbage. The Victorian bride sat, corseted, confused, and catastrophically uninformed. You see, it wasn't that Victorian brides were innately frightened creatures, prone to melodrama and fainting fits at the mere sound of the word bedchamber. No, their apprehension was painstakingly cultivated, nurtured even, by an elaborate societal choreography of miscommunication, repression, and lace-trimmed ignorance. By the time a young woman reached marriageable age, usually sometime after surviving an ocean of needlepoint samplers and attempting not to make eye contact with any young men lest their very eyebrows suggest unseemly thoughts, she might have a grasp of Latin declensions, the finer points of watercolor landscapes, and precisely how to replump a settee cushion. But the facts of marital intimacy, on that subject, Victorian society was as mute as a library on Sunday. There were euphemisms, of course, delicately murmured phrases about wifely duties and the husband's right. Occasionally, an older mother or aunt might take the bride aside the day before the wedding for what was likely the least informative conversation in human history, full of strained metaphors involving garden gates and letting things happen naturally. The advice might end with a tremulous sip of sherry and the solemn warning, "It may be uncomfortable, but just lie still, dear." In the absence of honest conversation, misinformation swirled like a crinoline caught in a draft. Whispered rumors among girls at finishing schools painted a picture of the wedding night that diverged wildly from reality, ranging from the terrifying to the outright anatomically impossible. Meanwhile, the grooms weren't necessarily better prepared. Unless they'd had a particularly candid valet or spent a questionable summer in Paris, many Victorian men entered matrimony guided by vague mythologies and a lifetime of polite restraint. Let's just say the steamiest moment in Mr. Darcy's relationship with Elizabeth Bennet involved a very intense handflex. So, after the cake crumbs had settled and the rice was picked out of one's bonnet, the Victorian newlyweds found themselves alone, in a room, with a bed, and the social expectation that something matrimonial was supposed to happen. And what did that room look like, you ask? Imagine a bed the size of a small schooner, carved grotesquely with mahogany cherubs who stared judgmentally from the headboard. Heavy curtains swaddled the windows in funereal folds. A chamber pot lurked ominously under an antimacassar-covered chair. There were lacy nightshirts that sacrificed all function for modesty, sometimes buttoned all the way to the chin, and slippers that squeaked at inopportune moments. Candles flickered unevenly, as if trying to politely look away. Is it any wonder some brides burst into tears and demanded to go home to mother, while grooms paced nervously, unsure whether to initiate conversation or call for tea? Of course, not all wedding nights were disasters, but many were decidedly more awkward than amorous. Physicians of the era, trained in the art of discerning female nerves from actual ailments and prone to recommending bed rest or smelling salts for both, frequently received letters from distraught husbands confused about why things had not gone according to, let's say, the romantic novels they had hesitantly glanced through in private. Occasionally, a scandalized bride would believe herself to have suffered a medical catastrophe, having been thoroughly unprepared for the physical realities of intimacy. Some even consulted doctors, who were expected to explain such things while still avoiding all the most obvious words. It was a delicate dance, explaining the human body while giving no offense to the listener's sensibilities or their milliner. And at the very heart of it all was the culture's enduring suspicion that sexuality, when not shrouded in silk and secrecy, might cause anything from hysteria to a spontaneous loss of tea privileges. The result was generations of people entering marriage with all the enthusiasm of someone about to undergo amateur dentistry. Still, the Victorian era was not entirely without its quiet, candle-glow moments of marital learning. Many couples who started out with fear gradually stumbled toward affection. But it must be said, when society writes a script with no dialogue, it leaves its actors whispering in the dark. Whispering, perhaps, until the moment their relatives demanded to know, with improper eagerness, whether the union had been consummated. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. That particular dinner party inquisition deserves its own scene, and perhaps a fainting couch or two. Back in the great lacy bosom of the Victorian era, few things were more practiced and poorly understood than procreation. This may come as a gentle surprise, given the volume of children Victorians seem to produce. 13 per family on average, if one believed the more colourful family portraits, and judging by their expressions, none of them were quite sure how they got there. You see, the Victorian approach to marital education was elusive, like a fox hiding behind a teacup. Parents, cloaked in treacle-thick decorum, generally avoided the subject of marital relations with the kind of tenacity normally reserved for evading tax collectors or uncomfortable casseroles. While a modern parent might have the talk with some nervous pacing and a PowerPoint, Victorian mothers preferred a mysterious nod toward a silk nightgown, perhaps a reference to duty, and then a fade to black more abrupt than a candle in a drafty hallway. Enter the wedding night terror. Many a Victorian bride went into matrimony armed with needlepoint skills, a dowry list, and a soul-deep confusion about what precisely was expected to happen after the dancing ended. Some were told it would be unpleasant. Others, far worse, were told nothing at all. Picture a young woman, 19, freshly corset liberated and peering at the marital bed like it's a battlefield masquerading as a mattress. Her new husband, a man she's perhaps met only 3 times, all at family-approved events involving overcooked lamb, is equally unsure, shuffling about the room like he's just read a manual in a foreign language that left out chapter 1. Men were often hardly more enlightened. Though gentlemen's clubs in Mayfair had well-stocked bars and a surplus of monocles, they were less helpful when it came to human anatomy than one might hope. Popular health guides of the time either censored the act entirely or dressed it in such biblical language that it became more of a spiritual riddle, and lo, he knew her carnally, than a useful primer. Fear on the wedding night wasn't just emotional, it was medicinal. Brace yourself for the tragedy that is womb wandering. According to lingering medieval beliefs, yes, even in the 19th century, it was thought the uterus could roam about the female body like a lost cat, causing hysteria and fainting spells. The idea was that sexual activity, conducted properly and with moderation, could anchor it like a well-behaved house pet. This, we can agree, is not the kind of biological theory one wants bouncing around one's head the night they're meant to become a spouse. And so everyone was nervous. Some brides fainted, literally fell straight to the velvet rug the moment the bedroom door clicked shut. It was common enough that fainting couches were part of most furniture catalogues, often set just feet away from the bed, ready to catch a swooning bride before she chipped a molar. Physicians might even be on call, sometimes pacing in the parlor below, especially in noble households where everything, including consummation, was apparently a team sport. There were also gift books left discreetly for brides by well-meaning friends or maiden aunts. These guides, with titles like The Pathway to Womanhood or Stella's Bridal Wisdom, fluttered delicately around the subject like butterflies avoiding a sacred puddle. They urged patience, virtue, and the importance of genuine affection, but stopped tragically short of spelling out how anyone's anatomy was actually involved. And then, of course, there was the immense pressure of duty. A woman was expected to be both demure and willing, modest and fertile, terrified yet cheerful. This confusing cocktail of expectations left many young women in a mental fog, thick enough to butter a crumpet with. For men, the fear was different. Messing it up, being too forward, not forward enough, or perhaps revealing their utter ignorance. In short, romantic triumph was far less likely than awkward hovering and a mutual desire to simply go to sleep. Some newlyweds even delayed consummation by weeks, citing anything from travel fatigue to celestial alignment. Not that anyone talked about it. No one, ever, spoke openly about these things. One did not recall one's first time over tea and scones. Instead, one quietly decided to never think about it again and hoped fervently things would improve with time. And perhaps, for some, it did. But for many, the wedding night was not the start of a romantic novel, but the awkward first chapter of an unedited manuscript full of misunderstandings, social pressure, and strategically dimmed candlelight. And yet, just as the sun eventually humbles the fog, time and experience tended to soften even the tensest of Victorian unions. But before such comfort could settle in, there was still one gathering storm cloud on the near horizon, the mysterious and utterly mystifying realm of marital advice from the clergy. In the porcelain twilight of Victorian England, it wasn't just shadowy alleyways or chimney soot that sent shivers up respectable spines. It was bedsheets. Yes, you heard right. Sheets. Those innocent squares of fabric, starched to military crispness, played a starring role in one of the more disquieting traditions of a wedding night, while lace curtains fluttered gently and tea cooled slowly on silver trays. Upstairs, somewhere behind closed doors and moral fortitude, there loomed the concept of proving the marriage. Now, before you snuggle too deeply into your pillow, picturing candlelit luxury, we must revisit the invention of a particularly awkward fusion of medieval custom and Victorian etiquette, the bloody sheet ritual. This sounds like something from a Gothic penny, dreadful, but it was, in some circles, chillingly real. You see, in earlier centuries, a bride's virginity wasn't just a private detail, it was social currency. While the Victorians had no legitimate reason to keep this theatrical tradition going, they did love a bit of medieval cosplay when it suited their moral narratives. So, especially among the upper crust and rural traditionalists, the practice lingered like that one cousin nobody invited, but who always found the address. The scene unrolls like a grimly farcical play. After the ceremonious vows, the cake, and the guests, who'd all eaten too much blancmange, the newlyweds were ushered off to their chambers. One hopes for a curtain, at least, a touch of privacy, but alas, in the grander homes, servants might hang about under the pretense of assisting. The couple was gently encouraged, or subtly pressured, to do their marital duty that very night, not necessarily because of passion, but to ensure the union was complete, legal, verified. And how did one verify such sanctity? Well, the morning after, or sometimes minutes after, a piece of the wedding bed linen would be triumphantly displayed for family or servants. A small token of success. Some even held it up as if it were the Holy Grail, only significantly less magical and markedly more awkward. Now, keep in mind, this ritual had less to do with religion and more with property. Marriage in Victorian England was as much about transactions as it was about romance. A chaste bride was thought to guarantee pure bloodlines and secure inheritances. Men wanted certainty they weren't marrying into ready-made parenthood, and society, ever the nosy neighbor, wanted to bask in moral confirmation. But what if there was no evidence? That's where things got imaginative. Some brides, either due to nerves or a wildly uncooperative hymen, had no visible results. This sparked an underground market of ingenuity. One could, if one had the right governess or scandalously informed lady's maid, procure a tiny vial of animal blood, discreetly spilled where it mattered. Or one might stage a minor injury. An accidental pinprick with an overly sharp hairpin assuredly did the trick. It's also worth noting that some brides, entirely uninterested in their husband's company altogether, were very grateful for these solutions. After all, Victorian morality didn't provide much space for a woman to simply say, "Actually, I'd rather read a novel." So quietly bleeding a sheep for the sake of dignity was, in some circles, far preferable to the real thing. Meanwhile, the grooms, those paragons of top hats and inherited awkwardness, were rarely expected to perform quite so theatrically. Their performance was assumed, unproven. Society, ever generous in its double standards, kept its microscope fixed squarely on the bride. A mantle of purity was demanded of her, whether or not she truly wore it. And so, wedding nights became a tangle of nerves, not for reasons of passion, but proof. The irony, of course, is that in all this attempt to verify purity, the entire affair was steeped in suspicion and pretense. As the oil lamps flickered and carriages echoed down cobbled streets, one had to wonder, who exactly was this performance for? That answer lies in the drawing rooms, the back doors of gossip-harried kitchens, and the polite murmurs exchanged behind lace-gloved hands. It was for everyone but the newlyweds themselves. Now stretch your toes, dear listener, and picture those beds of carved mahogany and stiff pillows where newly married couples lay, not in bliss, but in apprehension. History was not a gentle bedfellow. Let us drift toward what happened next. When the awkward dawn arrived, breakfast was served, and the expectations of a proper marriage stretched far beyond the boudoir, far from the fluttering of lace fans and clinking of toasting glasses. Something altogether more peculiar awaited newlywed Victorians behind bedroom doors, a very literal sense of dread. And not just the fumbling variety, though that certainly played a role. Tonight, we slip quietly into the hushed halls of Victorian households, where the drama didn't always end with, "I do." Sometimes it only began with the snuffing of the bridal sweet candle. You see, for many young women of the time, the wedding night was their first practical lesson in, well, anything that sniffed vaguely of anatomical intimacy, thanks to a potent mix of high society modesty, religious fervor, and mothers who routinely handed their daughters off to matrimony with advice limited to "close your eyes and think of England." Education on human reproduction had all the clarity of a foggy London morning. Entire marriage manuals were published, stuffed with euphemisms so thick one could mistake bodily congress for a diplomatic summit. But ignorance was not bliss. It was, more often, terror. Imagine a 19-year-old bride, freshly peeled from a corset tighter than a banker's purse strings, thrown into a scenario she wasn't just unprepared for, but warned against in whispers behind parlor doors. Husbands, likewise, were not universally initiated Casanovas. Some were bashful bachelors, others instructed by equally baffling guides that recommended things like firmness without undue haste, as one oddly phrased 19th century gentleman's handbook helpfully advised. Medicine, too, lent its own heavy, silk-gloved hand to the confusion. Mid-century doctors issued solemn warnings about the perils of unchecked passion. Too much excitement, they said, could lead to everything from hysteria to spinal dislocation. Yes, truly. Some even claimed that an excess of carnal enthusiasm could damage the womb or cause one's moral constitution to dissolve like a sugar cube in strong tea. So, the wedding night became a minefield of emotional expectations and biological misinformation. One particularly outstanding artifact of this era's prudish panic is the existence of wedding night letters. Some mothers, unable to cross the Rubicon of a proper conversation, would pen vaguely tragic notes to their daughters, heavy with sentiment and utterly light on facts. These missives might read, "My dearest Clara, tonight you will come to know the solemn duty of womanhood. You must bear it with grace, dignity, and a willingness to submit in silence." Frankly, a warning note about thunderstorms would have been more illuminating. And then there were the beds themselves. Not the comforting haven of duvets and decorative pillows we know today, but elaborately carved cathedrals of discomfort. Tall, creaky, encased in canopies thick enough to smother sound, and perhaps, conveniently, cries of confusion or the blunt querying of, Is this going right? It is worth remembering that conversations about consent, mutual pleasure, or even shared awkwardness were almost entirely absent. Marriage was a duty. The night that followed, a ritual hazed in nerves and embroidered secrecy. In some circles, the night was scripted down to ritualized undressing. The newlyweds were often assisted, yes, assisted, by trusted servants or relatives, in what can only be described as a thoroughly unromantic game of grown-up dress-up. Picture a puzzled groom in mutton chops watching his new wife be unlaced layer by layer, loosening her petticoats like some elaborate frilly onion, all under the watchful eye of Aunt Agatha, who made sure no improprieties occurred before the moment was officially handed off to fate, and perhaps a trembling doorknob. Even the law had opinions about what needed to happen behind those closed doors. A marriage wasn't just emotional. It was, in many legal senses, incomplete until the partners had consummated it in the most Victorianly vague way possible. Entire court cases hinged on whether the act had occurred in full, whether it had occurred successfully, or whether someone had simply changed their mind upon discovering what it actually entailed. And for the unfortunate, there was the doctor's visit, when things went so negatively awry that medical intervention was sought the very next day. This wasn't uncommon. There are actual documented accounts of young couples seeking help for bruised egos and possibly other bits, all due to ill-prepared explorations. One physician wrote in his case notes that the patient was wounded in morale and modesty, no injury visible upon inspection. Victorian medicine, always ready to offer a fainting couch instead of a capsule. So, when the last guests stumbled home and the wedding cake sat half sliced and forsaken in the drawing room, the true test began. Not of love, necessarily, but of survival, decorum, and navigating an encounter that everyone expected but no one wanted to talk about. But just as the night deepens and uncertainty swells, we find ourselves quietly inching toward the chamber of learning, a rather cold and creaky one titled Marriage Advice Literature. Yes, soon we'll unwrap the curious books given to hopeful and terrified brides and grooms, manuals so opaque they might as well have been written by Martians with a fondness for metaphors, by the warm, flickering glow of gaslight and the distant rattle of a horse-drawn cab fading down a London lane. A peculiar group of guardians gathered around a velvet-laid parlour table. They were not soldiers, not clergy, nor even the more common. Protectors of decency, like Lady Augusta's League, for the preservation of modest poetry. No, they were something far more determined. Victorian mothers. In the realm of nuptial night anxiety, no force influenced more dread, or perhaps created it wholesale, than the well-meaning, thoroughly corseted matron. You see, in the serene chaos of a Victorian wedding, the bride's chief accessory was not her gown or her orange blossoms, but a thundering, mysterious silence. The Victorian mother, a paradox of gentility and scandal suppression, wielded two tools, the Bible in one hand and euphemism in the other. Words like duties were uttered in trembling tones, accompanied by vague references to what is expected and what cannot be spoken of. The impression left on the bride-to-be generally resembled someone preparing not for a night of wedded bliss, but an encounter with a fog-shrouded monster lurking beyond the threshold of decency. Let us drift for a moment into a cozy in a parlour in 1872. Here sits Miss Eleanor Hatherton, aged 22, hands gently folded over the most embroidered lap the Midlands had yet seen. Across from her floats her mother, Mrs. Hatherton, swathed in layers of bombazine and unspoken trauma. "Eleanor, darling," her mother begins, eyes darting toward the lace curtains as if they might swish open to reveal Queen Victoria herself. "You must, that is, you shall be brave." A pause. The clock ticks judgmentally on the mantel. "There are things a wife must endure. For love," she clarifies hastily, though the word love sounds like it's been ironed and buried under 6 feet of propriety. "It will not be entirely unpleasant if you remember your prayers." Thus ends Eleanor's primer on conjugal relations, and there, dear listener, was the core of the confusion. Girls were trained to embroider, to play piano, to faint artistically, but the closest they came to human biology was the knowledge that nervous disposition could be treated with smelling salts, and hysteria was best managed by fainting onto a chaise lounge. Men, meanwhile, were often left to their own devices, truly a terrifying prospect in a world before Google and far, far before wholesome marital blogs with gentle diagrams. Often the young groom would receive a short, embarrassed talk from an uncle or a school chum who'd heard a thing or two behind the stables. The rest was filled in through schoolboy myth, scandalous French postcards, or pure panicked imagination. The result? Two people, dressed like badly upholstered settees, alone in a candlelit room, each terrified that the other might faint, panic, or perhaps disintegrate altogether at the prospect of physical affection. And so, wedding nights often began not with passion, but negotiations. The phrase, "Shall I ring for tea?" was uttered more than "I love you," and the most daring move might be the husband awkwardly offering to remove the bride's shoes, slowly, reverently, with the same anxiety as handling nitroglycerin. On occasion, the groom would flee to the billiard room or take a brisk 2-hour walk. The bride, meanwhile, might pretend to have a sudden, tragic case of fatigue and stage a genteel collapse to avoid confrontation entirely. Indeed, the wedding night was less a moment of romantic union and more a high-stakes performance piece in Victorian stagecraft. The bedroom, draped in monogrammed linens and social expectation, was the silent arena where myths about purity, duty, and the unknown collided like two icebergs in uncomfortable gloves. Some couples would muddle through the night in a haze of chaste confusion, while others, growing desperate for instruction, turned to that most sacred of Victorian publications, the Etiquette Manual. These did not help. Most simply recommended common sense, good manners, and, I kid you not, keeping the windows slightly open for the health of the room. And so, as the fire dwindled and the world drifted into slumber beneath the weight of moral corsetry, the newlyweds often found themselves lying side by side with matching expressions of apprehension, listening to the distant ticking of the clock and wondering quietly if asking one's spouse to hold hands might be considered scandalous. Just imagine how many sighs were sighed on those lace-trimmed pillows. But as we tiptoe away from the softly glowing bedroom, let's follow a different thread, one carried not by whispers or etiquette books, but by the rustling pages of an unexpected text found tucked within a groom's waistcoat pocket, as the flickering glow of gas lamps softened the corners of velvet parlors, and the clink of brandy glasses grew faint beneath layers of wallpapered silence. Many Victorian young men found themselves nervously polishing their boots, again, for no real reason. It wasn't jitters about their bride's opinion on footwear. No, it was dread. Sheer, uncomfortable, starch-collared dread about what was, or more accurately, wasn't, supposed to happen on the wedding night. Contrary to the swooning portraits painted by penny romances of the age, reality for many grooms on their nuptial evening was equal parts fear and confusion. You see, most young men of the respectable classes entered marriage with the same depth of understanding of intimacy as they had about dragon fruit or particle physics. They'd heard rumors, perhaps, odd drawings at boarding school, whispered locker room myths involving ankles and nightgowns, but precious little in the way of usable instruction. Victorian society, particularly among the well-mannered classes, operated under a labyrinth of politely sealed envelopes. That is, crucial information was withheld in the name of propriety. Mothers didn't speak to sons about that business, and fathers preferred throwing a coin purse at the lad and leaving him to interpret meaning from the thud it made. The most guidance a groom might receive, if lucky, was a bottle of brandy and a percussive clap on the back from an older uncle with a cryptic wink and the grim encouragement, "Be brave, boy." Naturally, this left men alone in darkened bedrooms, standing in awkward anticipation in front of equally mystified brides. One can imagine these nervous couples staring at each other over wax-dotted sheets, like two Victorian house cats that had just been introduced for mating, uncertain, tense, and inexplicably angry. Now, if you're wondering where these men might have learned of the biological and emotional mechanics of marriage, let us momentarily pause at the rather literary battleground of the Victorian Marriage Manual. These tomes, handsomely bound and often unpleasantly titled, were a curious genre nestled between devotional texts and cookbooks in proper households. The titles gave little away. Advice for young wives, or plain words on plain subjects might. They sound helpful, but their pages were dense with euphemisms, Victorian flower metaphors, and stern, motherly warnings about the possibility that passion could, in fact, be misused, like leaving the gas burner too long unattended. One popular manual advised newlyweds to approach intimacy with seriousness, modesty, and an eye toward temperance in all things, which, translated, meant don't enjoy it too much, and whatever you do, don't make noise. The idea of keeping passion restrained and spirits pure created a breed of marital interaction that was, perhaps, more akin to a handshake after filing taxes. For many grooms, the night ended not with romance, but with a sleeping draught and profound spiritual crisis. One splendid remedy, or so it was suggested by a well-known reverend-turned-marriage advisor, was prayer. Long, unbroken prayer. Sometimes these acts of spiritual devotion would last so far into the night that both man and wife, by the time they reached Amen, would be too tired to remember what they'd been fretting about in the first place. Humbling as it is to imagine today, the full experience of Victorian marital duties often unfolded slowly over weeks or even months of awkward negotiation, mixed guidance, medical confusion, and the overuse of lavender-scented patience. Failure to consummate swiftly wasn't terribly unusual. In fact, many Victorian doctors considered it entirely normal, especially if the couple had been raised in a world that barely admitted knees existed. But there were, to the growing anxiety of young men, consequences, social, medical, and personal. A nervous bridegroom might confidentially visit his physician with trembling hands and whispered concerns about failure. And doctors, being medical professionals of the era, would often respond with a curious cocktail of laudanum, vague encouragement about vital fluids, and a pamphlet titled something like Proper Conduct for Man and Wifely Duty, with reference to Aristotle. Oh, how the flicker of the honeymoon oil lamp covered many a quivering moustache in shadowy rescue. And so, in the lamplight of lace-curtained bedrooms across England, shy young husbands, dressed like butlers attending their own appointment, found themselves deep in uncharted territory. Sent forth with no compass but buzzwords like temperance and reproductive imperative. But not all fears came from ignorance. Some arose from darker, more complicated beliefs. Well-meaning science gone sideways, and medicine that might do more harm than honeymoon. And that, dear dreamer, is where we'll wander next. The sun dipped low on another Victorian day, casting a golden, smog-smeared glow through the lace curtains of a drawing room where a particularly anxious bride might be sipping her fourth cup of weak, bergamot-tinged tea. You see, as the 19th century rolled steadily along, with its horse-drawn carriages, unblinking gas lamps, and relentless moral rigidity, it was both a glorious and terrifying time to fall in love, or to at least be nudged into matrimony by one's social obligations and a formidable aunt named Honoria. It might surprise modern hearts to learn that as much dread as there was delight simmered beneath those layers of satin and tulle. The Victorian wedding night, not the ceremony, not the cake, which was often dense enough to be weaponized, not even the melancholy poetry read aloud, was the true apex of bridal anxiety. And a stunning portion of that apprehension came from one place: books. Ah, yes, books, that most romantic of inventions, and yet, in Victorian times, also a considerable source of fear. For while novels were packed with swooning heroines and exceptionally absent or dead mothers, they very rarely, if ever, explained what came after the wedding. A young woman might read hundreds of pages about roses, glances, carriage rides, and fainting in drawing rooms. But when it came to the carnal mysteries of the nuptial bed, the pages went suddenly, conspicuously, blank. Enter the marriage manual, bound in somber leather and often discreetly delivered in brown paper packaging. These tomes were the closest thing many women, and indeed men, had to sexual education. Titles like The Reproductive System as a Moral Compass, or advice to mothers on the management of their offspring and their menfolk promised clarity. What they delivered was confusion and the nagging sense that something terrible might happen should the Lord not be properly consulted beforehand. Imagine the young couple, tucked gingerly into their wedding suite, trying to decipher a sentence like, "The gentleman must apply himself with patient vigor, keeping always in view the sanctity of the act and the preservation of the lady's spiritual blossom." Now, try to imagine anyone relaxing after that. Some manuals, not content to baffle, dabbled in veiled threats. One advised that frequent marital relations could lead to physical enervation, spiritual fatigue, and a subtle but irreversible decline of one's moral backbone. Quite the buzzkill. Even more enjoyably bizarre was the idea, floated in certain circles, that a man should be as distant and gentle with his bride as a bishop is with a teacup. There were physicians, real ones, with absolutely plausible sideburns, who warned that any sudden movement or unseemly vigor from the groom could fracture the lady's nerves. In some cases, this lack of physical clarity had hilarious consequences. There are more than a few diary entries from Victorian women who went to bed on their wedding night, assuming nothing was really meant to happen, and awoke appalled to find their husbands attempting something. It didn't help, of course, that women were told so little about their own bodies. A solid education might tell a young lady how to embroider a lemon, but left her entirely ignorant of her anatomy. Many believed that pleasure was something reserved only for men, and whispered rumors swirled among maids and cousins about what really happened once the lights were out and the corset was off. Few, if any, felt prepared, and so fear filled the vacuum, a fog of dread wafting over the honeymoon suite like an overcooked calf's head stew. Even Queen Victoria herself, despite ultimately producing a veritable philharmonic orchestra of children, began her marital affections with a distinctly Victorian mixture of nervousness and duty. She wrote tenderly of her first night with Prince Albert as a moment both deeply serious and exhilarating, as if she'd simultaneously discovered true love and a surprise inspection by the Royal Morals Committee. All of this, the confusion, the manuals, the 13 petticoats between longing and logistics, created a uniquely Victorian phenomenon. Wedding nights that felt less like romantic milestones and more like poorly planned obstacle courses written by someone who'd only heard about intimacy through heavily censored telegrams. And yet, amidst the lace-trimmed uncertainty, a quiet humor lives. Human beings, after all, have always floundered in the dark a bit, literally and figuratively. Love is a curious beast, sometimes best stumbled into with trembling hands and a vague idea of what one should be doing. And if you're armed with kindness, patience, and perhaps a few diagrams not written by someone named Reverend Percival Queasel, well, the night might yet turn out all right. Now, as the gaslights flicker low and the fire in the grate murmurs softly to itself, let us drift toward another cozy corridor of this curious age, where the advice given to brides was bewildering, heartfelt, and, on occasion, utterly unhinged. As we drift closer toward the canopy-draped horrors of the Victorian wedding night, it's only fitting to pause and observe one of the quietest, yet most panic-inducing, creatures of this curious ritual, the wedding night advice book. You might imagine such a book would be a soothing tome, something like Sensibility and Satin Sheets, what to expect when you're expecting to be terrified. But no, these little volumes, often hidden behind teapots or stuffed inside piano benches, were a curious blend of biblical fervor, biological confusion, and metaphorical mayhem. The tidy Victorians, unable to speak of their own needs without blushing, turned to literature for answers and came away, more often than not, with a head full of trembling questions. Take, for instance, the dazzlingly euphemistic title, The Wedding Night and Its Duties, a bestseller among the anxious betrothed around 1860. One can almost hear the marriage vows trembling under the weight of the word duties. And yet, what followed inside was not quite a riot of helpful diagrams or friendly discourse. No, these books were careful not to name things directly. Rather than body parts, they spoke of gardens, keys, and once, rather confusingly, the inner sanctums of divine union, which one poor soul misread as a reference to prayer and ended up fainting during the attempt. Authors of these manuals varied wildly in tone. Some were gentle, whispering through delicate prose about the sacred bond of man and wife, while others adopted a more, shall we say, disciplinary approach, scolding young brides not to be hysterical during what was, according to one 1872 text, a necessary though spiritually testing moment for womankind. Ah yes, the ever-present Victorian obsession with hysteria, a mythical female ailment blamed on nearly everything from indigestion to having opinions. And wedding nights were a suspected trigger. A nervous bride might suffer from womb wanderings, a now debunked belief that her uterus might become dislodged, like a disobedient cat hiding behind the organ bench if she were too overcome with emotion. To prevent such wandering anatomy, some books recommended light fragrances, gentle music, and in extreme cases, soft weeping beforehand to purge excessive sentiment. But while brides were advised to wash away their maidenly sensibilities, grooms weren't exactly handed a map and compass either. The vast majority of Victorian grooms entered the bedroom with slightly less useful information than a lost traveller in a foggy hedge maze. Their books were equally cryptic, often peppered with phrases like garden gate, conjugal embrace, and the stove of manly vigour, none of which came with instructions and all of which came with soaring expectations. One particularly infamous advice pamphlet by a reverend of dubious credentials warned young men not to overwhelm the womanly constitution with unduly hasty enthusiasm, which is Victorian for don't startle her into a fainting spell by being too chipper. Other manuals sternly reminded gentlemen that young brides must not be approached as one approaches a slab of mutton, which leads us to believe that someone, at some point, had done just that and ruined both dinner and decorum. Laced with religious fervour, these books often attempted to elevate the act of marriage consummation into a heavenly deed. Which sounds lovely, until you realise the same book also compares the bride to a lamb at the altar. Again, not helpful, and slightly unsettling for those who had hoped for warm affection, rather than the emotional weight of a paschal sacrifice. What's most telling is the way so many of these texts ended, not with fulfillment, joy, or clarity, but with a sighing return to moral instruction and the importance of bearing heirs. It was as though Victorian society had to tiptoe delicately, even on the page, through a process that was supposed to be natural, yet was treated as something just shy of attempting alchemy on your living room rug, with help from an indecipherable manual. So as night candles were blown out, and uneasy spouses slipped beneath starched sheets, clutching their respective pamphlets behind their backs like secret weapons, one thing became clear. Nobody really knew what they were doing, but everyone was fairly certain they weren't supposed to enjoy it. And with that image gently flickering, imagine the bedroom quiet once again, just a whisper of wind against lace curtains. We'll wander next into the peculiar sleeplessness that followed, when the ceremony was over. But the real performance had only begun. Somewhere in the warm glow of kerosene lamps and tightly buttoned bodices, the Victorian wedding night loomed like an ominous cloud dressed in lace. It was not, as one might imagine, a scene swept from a romantic novel with rose petals and heartfelt declarations. No, this was an occasion soaked in anxiety, ritualized awkwardness, and enough undisclosed expectations to fill a mahogany hope chest. Among the most peculiar customs nestled into the marital tapestry of the era was a little-known tradition called the stocking ceremony. One might assume this involved hosiery and flirtation, perhaps a saucy garter toss or some stirring embroidery. But the reality was less titillating and far more committee-driven. After the marriage feast, which featured plenty of blancmange and not nearly enough explanations, bride and groom would retire to their chamber. But they were not alone. Oh no. Family members, often the very same ones who had elbowed each other for trifle pudding hours earlier, would shuffle upstairs and observe as the newlyweds prepared for bed, in full formal wear. They would stay long enough to ensure the bride and groom were, as the phrase delicately went, settled. Then came the throwing of the stockings. One stocking from the bride, one from the groom, would be hurled across the room toward the bed. If one landed on the spouse, it was said they would be the dominant partner in the marriage. A sort of 19th century version of rock, paper, scissors, but with more yarn and judgmental aunts. This spectacle was not, as you might guess, comforting to the average Victorian couple, especially not to the brides, most of whom had arrived at the day with little more understanding of intimacy than what could be gleaned from blush-colored metaphors and botany books. In fact, botany, yes, actual plants, was sometimes their educational material. The language of flora carried double meanings: roses for romance, lilies for purity, rhubarb for, well, probably indigestion. But even that was more relatable than the abstract fear surrounding their wedding beds. In fashionable parlors and sewing circles, there were whispers of what lay ahead on that first night, vague testimonies and warnings muffled by propriety. The taboo was so complete, so meticulously cultivated, that a young woman might well walk up the aisle thinking a stork showed up sometime after the honeymoon with a helpful delivery and a stamped receipt. On the flip side, the groom wasn't necessarily prepared either. Victorian masculinity, stoic and mustachioed, often taught men about duty, discipline, and managing a ledger, but remarkably little about physical affection beyond tipping one's hat. Public schooling focused on Latin declensions rather than emotional intelligence. So some poor soul named Percival might find himself undressing beside a clockwork bride, both paralyzed by reverence, corsetry, and a crushing fear of doing something terribly incorrect. Let's not forget those infamous etiquette manuals, dry, moralizing documents that called themselves guides, but offered little more than general encouragement to remain upright and prayerful. One such manual suggested that purity was best preserved by abstaining from excessive eye contact, emotional outbursts, and invoking feeling of any kind. Remember, this was a society in which ankles were considered risque. Ankles. Imagine embarking on an entire lifetime of shared nudity and late-night crumpets after growing up in a world where ankles were scandalous. The result of this social choreography was a kind of nervous theatre in which spouses, expected to leap from formal acquaintanceship to lifelong intimacy in a single evening, often found themselves instead staring at the ceiling, side by side, amid the creaks of ancestral furniture and the faint scent of lavender potpourri. There might be polite small talk about the hors d'oeuvres, an awkward mention of the wedding cake tiers, and eventually, a long, ceremonious attempt to find sleep. Still, not every wedding night was a disaster. Sometimes two people stumbled through all that candle wax trepidation and found through shyness and lace-trimmed awkwardness something gentle and human. A hand reached, a breath shared, a chuckle over a snapped corset string. Even then, the moment was often not as romantic as novels pretended, but at least it was real. And real, however, shy and muddled, has its own kind of splendor. Nestled now between such stories and 1,000 tightly laced dreams, let your thoughts drift like falling petals toward what came next. The curious remedies concocted to soothe virginal nerves and solve certain conjugal complications. But that, of course, is another softly whispered tale. As the soft glow of gaslight flickered across heavy damask wallpaper and the whisper of silk skirts quieted in the corridor, the Victorian bride found herself, at long last, alone on her wedding night. And this, dear dreamer, is when the true terror began. You see, contrary to the lace-draped illusions of romance novels and all that sonnet-soaked nonsense, the wedding night in Victorian times was rather less about stolen kisses and more about silent dread. We've arrived, rather gingerly, at the moment when reality ousted ceremony, when the finely corseted bride layered in 16 pounds of satin and societal expectations, faced the confounding mystery lurking behind the bedroom door: her husband, and perhaps even more frightening, herself. Now, it's important to remember that many Victorian women entered marriage with astoundingly little idea of what marriage actually entailed. Romantic ideals were dutifully draped over every tea party and engagement announcement, but explicit conversations about physical intimacy, oh no, those were unmentionable. Discussing relations, as they were politely termed, usually while whispering and fanning oneself, was considered not only improper, but bordering on moral indecency. Mothers, bless them, were notoriously tight-lipped. If a daughter was lucky, she might receive a vague reference on the eve of her wedding, something along the lines of, "Just go along with it, dear, and try to think of Queen Victoria," which, when you think about it, is perhaps the one sentence least suited to preparing anyone for an intimate encounter. Books? Ah, those print-bound. Tutors were often more confusing than helpful. Some young brides armed themselves with Charles Darwin's The Descent of Man, hoping for insight. Others read spiritual guides that stated things like, "It is a wife's sacred duty to submit to her husband, for his desires are anchored in God's design," which sounded suspiciously more like a power structure than a pillow talk primer. Husbands weren't much better off, really. Raised in the same corseted culture, many were more familiar with Seneca's theories on moral virtue than with how to lead a gentle and respectful first night. Some took their cues from Victorian medicine, which, if we recall, wasn't exactly a festival of enlightenment. Medical manuals described the female reproductive system with the same tone one might use to describe a haunted forest: dark, mysterious, and best left alone unless properly guided by a professional. And then there was the matter of the wedding bed itself. These were not modern, memory foam delights, but creaky, four-poster monuments to discomfort. Dressed in embroidered counterpanes, surrounded by family portraits who seemed to stare disapprovingly down from every wall. Nothing says romance like Great Aunt Mabel scowling above the headboard. Privacy, too, was a scarce and fragile thing. In many upper-class homes, it was not uncommon for housemaids to stage-manage bedtime rituals, drawing the curtains, stoking the fire, and undressing the bride with the same brisk efficiency used for preparing turn-down service. Couples often spent their wedding night under the cautious ears of an entire household staff. Imagine trying to express delicate vulnerability when Mrs. Pottle, the cook, was just one corridor away, stuffing marrow into a roast goose. Then there was the bride's silent panic. She might not have known what to do, what to say, or even what to expect beyond vague warnings and fluttering metaphors like the marriage duty. The word duty was awfully popular, you'll notice. Romance rarely got a speaking role, and some poor dears were utterly convinced that the act itself might kill them. Victorian women had been conditioned to venerate virginity as the essence of virtue, and so crossing into the unknown was occasionally viewed with the existential dread of a philosophical cliff dive. Diaries from the era chronicle tears, trembling, and the occasional carefully concealed fainting spell, not rapture and roses. Not to be outdone, some grooms were also paralyzed by fear, afraid of doing something wrong, of sullying this supposedly angelic creature who until that night had been considered almost ethereal. A good many simply postponed the whole ordeal until morning, or longer. Yes, some couples managed to coexist like emotionally repressed roommates for months, even years, before anything of a conjugal nature ever transpired. All in all, it wasn't so much a night of passion as it was a careful, awkward negotiation between two thoroughly confused people, neither of whom particularly wanted to be first to admit they had no idea what was going on. And so, the candle burned low, stifled by silks and shame, while two hearts beat faster, not out of love, but of overwhelming anxiety. Ah, the romance of it all. But fear not, dear listener, While the bedroom offered mysteries, wrapped in embroidered modesty, the Victorian world beyond it held even stranger expectations for marriage itself. As twilight slipped gently over the gabled rooftops of Victorian England, casting a soft lavender hue through lace-curtained windows, thousands of young brides sat in their candlelit chambers, trying to appear serene, while their stomachs collected butterflies by the dozen. There they were, corseted, coiffed, and catastrophically confused about what exactly was supposed to happen next. You see, in a society where one's worth could be measured by the ability to not ever mention bodily functions, or bodies in general, really, the wedding night was less about intimacy and more about deciphering a mystery dressed in white. For both bride and groom, the marital bed was not so much a welcoming bower of love as it was a stage for a performance neither had rehearsed and both were terrified to botch. Brides, in particular, were often shipped off into marriage with less education about sex than one might have about the origin of marmalade, which actually has some decent documentation, if you'd like me to digress. But another time, the ideal woman of the era, virtuous, delicate, and entirely ignorant of what lay beneath the gentlest euphemisms. Men, for their part, might boast more access to information, though it's worth noting that bachelor's guides of the time read more like Victorian fortune cookies than practical manuals. Now, into this thick fog of mystery came the so-called martial mechanics, often made worse by the involvement of mothers, governesses, or perilously poetic church leaders. Picture a flickering candle, a stiff-backed bed, a groom sweating into his high collar, and a bride who's just been told to think of England. That wasn't just a joke, by the way. The phrase, "close your eyes and think of England," gained mythic status in later retellings, though it's uncertain whether any real Victorian mother ever uttered it. Still, the sentiment stuck because it so perfectly captured the awkward doom that was the Victorian wedding night. Not a celebration, but a duty. Possibly nationalistic, certainly confusing. Let us wander for a moment into the world of bridal advice literature, a robust genre that flourished alongside tight-laced morality. A proper Victorian bride had little business asking questions, but the bookstands sizzled with pamphlets and pseudo-medical manuals offering pure guidance. Advice ranged from somewhat helpful, pray for understanding, to outright absurd, avoid looking in mirrors before bed to keep sin, at bay. One such manual, titled, with what must have been a straight face, What a Young Wife Ought to Know, suggested that any discontent a woman might feel on her wedding night was likely a failure of perspective. Right, because nothing steadies the nerves like blaming your own perception for the incoming doom. And then, of course, there were the spectacularly unhelpful diagrams. Anatomical sketches that looked like someone tried to draw a topographical map with trembling hands and no sense of scale. One popular publication was so vague in its illustrations that scholars joke it could have been mistaken for badly drawn plumbing, which, to be fair, is not entirely inaccurate. Let's not forget the medical professionals, who were always terribly eager to offer their unsolicited opinions. The hysteria doctors, those self-appointed champions of female peace and questionable gadgets, already had plenty of ideas about women's nervous systems, most of which misunderstood both nerves and systems. According to some, marital intimacy risked draining a woman of her finite energy stores. Evidently, Victorian medicine placed women somewhere between a wind-up toy and a souffle. Delightful, but easily ruined. So imagine the emotional menagerie perched atop the four-poster bed. Fear, confusion, perhaps a lurking governess who refused to leave the hallway. Sometimes servants were instructed to sleep just outside the door in case things went awry. This created a level of intimacy akin to sharing a honeymoon suite with your GP. And yet, amid all the awkwardness, there were, no doubt, glimmers of tenderness. Amid the rustle of layers and the creaking of floorboards, some couples genuinely stumbled into understanding, an act made all the more remarkable by how thoroughly society tried to keep them in the dark. For those who found themselves sobbing or cringing, or needing to pretend they had a sudden headache. Well, at least that was one. Victorian ailment everyone seemed able to diagnose and quietly ignore. But the wedding night, you see, was only the opening scene. What followed was an entire social theatre in which each and every morning after came with fresh worries, reputation, rumours, and the ever-present menace of laundry staff with too much information. Still, the newlyweds had made it. One night down, many more to navigate. And tomorrow would bring the morning rituals, the breakfast politics, and the subtle art of pretending everything had been perfectly ordinary, which, by Victorian standards, meant complete silence, and perhaps a well-timed faint. It was not uncommon as the 19th century rolled onward with the steady clatter of carriages and corsets for newlyweds to arrive at the bridal suite with the enthusiasm of two people about to conduct a business merger under duress, which, in spirit, many Victorian marriages rather were. But let us not underestimate the star performer of the wedding night. Awkward silence, garnished with lace. You see, for all their grandeur and moral certainty, the Victorians had an astonishing gift for not saying things. They organized society on a particularly stiff scaffolding of euphemisms, where ankles were scandalous, and the word leg was delicately avoided in polite company, lest it spark sudden thoughts of billiards or, heaven forbid, arousal. So, when a young bride reeled from the congratulations of assorted aunts bearing aspic and sage advice, and found herself alone with her new husband in a candlelit room that smelled of flower arrangements and shared apprehension, the stakes were rather high. She was expected to perform a role she likely hadn't been told existed until roughly 2 weeks before, in a letter from her clergyman uncle who'd wrapped the information in scripture and metaphors about garden tools. There was, however, help available, for a certain price, and only tacitly acknowledged. Enter the peculiar, if shadowy, world of matrimonial manuals. Such treasures often bore titles like The Wedding Night, What the Bride and Groom Should Know, a subtle name bordering on cheeky in its time. Written by self-appointed moralists masquerading as doctors, these guides offered earnest, if tinder dry, descriptions of what one might eventually piece together as the mechanics of conjugal life. The tone was rarely saucy, and often sounded as though someone was trying to describe a lightning storm using only biblical parables and knowledge of the digestive system. One popular book advised husbands to approach the union not as a collision of beasts, but as a spiritual joining, best achieved after shared hymn singing and a light supper. Given the period's fondness for heavy bread and sentimental piano ballads, one wonders how many new husbands simply fell asleep after their light supper. But the real intrigue lay in what these manuals didn't say. They hinted, prodded, and danced gingerly around human anatomy, like guests avoiding the scandalous parlor rug where Cousin Albert once passed out from sherry fumes. Rather than clarify, they often deepened the confusion. And so, anticipation on the wedding night was not just about intimacy. It was about decoding the simplest of gestures. Removing a glove might accidentally signal commitment to some irreversible act. A loosened corset, revolutionary, and the candlelight, while romantic in retrospect, more often served to hide flushing faces and eyes darting discreetly toward the fire escape. In some wealthier families, there was even talk, always uneasy, often whispered, of hiring a physician to explain things to the bride, or the groom, or both. These lectures, meant to be enlightening, often lasted 10 minutes and were cloaked in metaphors involving soil fertility and angels' wings. There was reportedly a doctor in Devon who'd mastered the entire subject using only gardening analogies. One doubts how many seedbeds were truly understood. Meanwhile, would-be spouses were told to expect unquestioning obedience, spiritual revelation, the possible threat of hysterics, and at least one pregnancy per calendar year. The pressure, unsurprisingly, was immense. In this climate of concealed expectations and overboiled advice, many Victorian newlyweds approached their wedding night with all the wild romanticism of a tax consultation. Some even postponed the event, citing nerves, fatigue, or, believably, a poorly trussed bustle. And hovering over all of this was the immense weight of moral reputation. Failing to consummate a marriage, or doing so in a manner deemed unorthodox, could result in gossip, scrutiny, even annulment. For women in particular, being deemed unwifely, a term so elastic it could stretch to include disliking mutton, was a real and constant threat. So, in the flicker of moonlight through lace curtains, a young couple might lie awake, side by side like statues, waiting for sleep or courage or a sign from whatever Victorian saints guarded the timid and confused. And eventually, perhaps, with enough whispered apologies and confused laughter, the room would settle into cautious intimacy, or more likely, into quiet snoring. But of course, not all fears were left at the bedroom door. Some followed the bride right into her new household. In just a moment, we'll step softly into one of the most peculiar myths that haunted the Victorian bride long after the bouquet had wilted. The wedding supper had been cleared away. The cake was in crumbs, the champagne in fading bubbles, and the bride's gloves, white kid leather, were now crumpled at her feet like the last semblance of innocence. The garters had been flung, the drunk uncle had been collected, and now there it was. The great, terrible, long-awaited moment. The wedding night. Victorian newlyweds found themselves alone finally, in a room fragrant with orange blossoms and the bone-clenching awkwardness of society's most terrifying tradition, marital intimacy. Not passion, not romance, certainly not familiarity, but rather an encounter scheduled by a vicar and choreographed by Queen Victoria's terrifying sense of decorum. You see, for most Victorian brides, and let's be honest, more than a few grooms, the wedding night was less sultry whispers under moonlight and more blindfolded spelunking through the wilderness of the human form. The sort of experience you face with the firm belief that if you simply close your eyes and pretend hard enough, you will eventually be left unscathed. The threat, of course, was modesty. Victorian society prized modesty the way modern internet influencers prize filtered lighting. It was the primary virtue a woman could possess, next to embroidery skill and the capacity to faint gracefully during sermons. To arrive on the wedding night without knowledge of the birds or the bees, or indeed any biological fauna whatsoever, was a mark that one had been properly raised. Young ladies, particularly of the upper classes, were often expected to drift angelically into marriage with no concept of what the nuptial act actually entailed. Some suspected it might be a sustained act of hand-holding, others, a strenuous form of prayer. Some presumed their husbands would simply whisper, "I have taken thee," and then everyone would go swiftly to sleep. There were, of course, wedding night manuals, written by doctors, clergymen, and well-meaning spinsters who used words like seed and union with the grave solemnity of a funeral procession. Many brides were handed these texts, often titled things like The Marital Embrace, A Guide for Godly Copulation, a title neither erotic nor reassuring. The poor dears might read phrases like, "The act should be performed with mutual sobriety and eyes gently averted," and proceed to spend their honeymoon clutching pillows and wondering whether death by fainting was socially acceptable. Now the grooms, many of them not much wiser than their wives, came under pressure of a different sort. They were expected to know what to do, and to do it without frightening the livestock, so to speak. But Persian rugs were slippy, corsets were complex, and the human anatomy was typically taught with the same urgency as whale migration patterns, distantly and with limited visual aids. This mutual confusion led to some extraordinary consequences. Letters from the time capture some heartbreaking, inadvertently hilarious encounters. One bride wrote to a friend weeks after her wedding, confessing that she and her husband were still unclear on the precise mechanics, but believed progress was imminent after rearranging the candle placement. Another husband confessed in his journal that he had attempted the act 3 times, but was put off by his wife sobbing and the sound of a cuckoo clock. Sometimes, if Both newlyweds were sufficiently terrified and sufficiently polite. The wedding night concluded with a handshake and a promise to try again next Tuesday. And then, of course, there was the bed. If you've ever imagined something grand and inviting, a canopied nest of silks and pillows, adjust your expectations. Many Victorian marriage beds were firm, formal, and about as cozy as a church pew. The bedding itself was usually comprised of linen sheets and scratchy wool blankets, possibly attended by a bolster that looked suspiciously like the family dog. There were no scented candles or romantic music, just a dim glow from a gas sconce and the muffled sound of the bridesmaid weeping discreetly down the hall. In wealthier households, the bedchamber itself was not always shared, at least not permanently. Separate sleeping quarters were not uncommon, and in some cases this arrangement was greeted with mild relief by both parties, at least after the initial scheduled performance had been attempted. In this landscape of veiled expectations and prudish instruction, romance was not the point. Duty was. Children were the inevitable product, not necessarily of desire, but of perseverance and occasional calendar-based scheduling. Love, if it came at all, arrived later, cautiously, like a cat uncertain where its bowl has been placed. Still, for all the awkwardness, some couples did bloom under the candlelight of married life. They discovered that their partner's hands were gentler than expected, that laughter could exist in whispered stumbles, and that affection was allowed to grow, even in the stuffy halls of societal expectation. And in the quiet dark of a heavily curtained room, above the crinkle of starch and the sigh of too high laces, a small voice might have said, "We'll figure it out, eventually." Now, as the drawn curtains flutter in a drafty Victorian night, let us peer a little further into the world outside the bedroom, where the very idea of divorce loomed like thunderclouds over the tropical optimism of matrimony. It's a curious thing, what happens when society builds a fortress of etiquette around something as slippery and stubbornly human as desire. You see, by the late Victorian era, the British had constructed an entire labyrinth of rules, euphemisms, and decorative hairpieces to avoid the embarrassment of simply existing in a body. So, when newlyweds of this upright, corset-suffocated society found themselves alone at last, behind the locked door of the honeymoon suite, well, let's just say, many didn't know which end of the emotional roller coaster they were on. There had been no classes in school about this, unless one counts the occasional Latin course taught by a man in a wool vest who used phrases like natural propagation and then immediately changed the subject to Caesar's campaigns. There had been no tips from parents, at least not directly. Mothers might sidle up with a misty look and whisper, "Be patient, dear," before pressing floral handkerchiefs into trembling hands and fleeing the room. Fathers. They found the sudden need to inspect the hedgerows or visit their club for several days in a row. And so, wobbly-limbed and wide-eyed, our Victorian couple might sit by the edge of the bed, a fire crackling uncertainly in the grate, each wondering which one of them was supposed to start. Whatever it was, one was supposed to start. Now, this wasn't merely a question of bashfulness. It stemmed from something deeper, a culture of mystification. For much of Victorian society, sex had the same mystery as astronomy, talked about in hushed tones, misunderstood by nearly everyone, and prone to grand, awkward misinterpretations. Consider the wedding night horror stories passed down like family heirlooms among married women. Novelist and social commentator Edith Lister, writing under a pseudonym to protect her husband's social standing, and, one suspects, his feelings, described her first night of marriage as an ordeal of sobs interrupted only by an alarming silence once he fell asleep. Suffice to say, she wasn't talking about snoring. Young brides were advised in no uncertain terms that nice girls knew nothing. To admit any foreknowledge was to risk ruining your carefully cultivated aura of purity, which, like a delicate trifle made predominantly of whipped eggs and social pressure, could collapse under examination. Even medical professionals, that bastion of what ought to have been sound advice, were thoroughly unreliable in Victorian Britain when it came to relationships of the more conjugal variety. Doctors warned women that too much enthusiasm in the bedroom could lead to hysteria, weak nerves, or worst of all, developing a taste for it, which, in turn, might morph into a woman who had opinions about things, such as her own enjoyment or, heaven forbid, the right to vote. Meanwhile, Victorians, men were often misled by literature, locker room whispers, and the vague implication that if one could select a good cigar or make firm eye contact with a horse, one could also successfully navigate a marriage bed. And so, the wedding night became less a triumphant union of passion and more a kind of moral escape room, two people trying to figure out what to do while solving invisible riddles using only handkerchiefs and socially prescribed shame. In wealthier households, help was sometimes just outside the door. Literally. In some cases, the bride's maid or mother might wait outside the honeymoon room, prepared to offer practical advice, blankets, or moral support, as soon as sounds suggested the event had commenced. And occasionally, those sounds were merely uncomfortable sneezes and the faint rustle of someone trying and failing to remove 37 buttons from their evening attire. And then, complications of clothing. Truly an underappreciated villain in the Victorian romance tragedy. Corsets so tight they could cause temporary fainting. Petticoats and crinolines cascading in layers like the icing on a wedding cake. Stockings gartered, labelled, and impossible to remove without at least one minor degree in engineering. It's no wonder then that for many couples, that first conjugal evening didn't result in fireworks, but awkward silences, mutual confusion, and perhaps the decision to simply have tea instead. Because when both parties have been raised to believe knowledge itself is shameful, even love can begin with a stammer. But not all was gloom and gingham. In time, many couples found their rhythm, made peace with their booby-trapped wardrobes, and carved out soft corners in the stiff architecture of Victorian marriage. After all, awkward beginnings don't mean unhappy ever-afters. They're just the warm-up act, slightly bungled. Now, as we drift gently onward, let's peer behind the faint, perfume-scented curtains of polite Victorian texts and examine the actual advice books that were smuggled into nightstands, shared among friends, and read under candlelight with wide, blinking eyes. While it is tempting to believe that every Victorian bride and groom dropped their silver spoons in shock at what awaited them on their wedding night, the truth is more delicate and often more amusing. By the late 19th century, the emotional math of marriage was a strange brew. 1 part awkward silence, 2 parts societal repression with a generous sprinkle of decorative lace. Among the more curious nuances was the role of the wedding bed itself. Not just a piece of bedroom furniture, oh no. This was practically an altar. It held expectations, rituals, and well-meaning but deeply uncomfortable familial blessings. It was not uncommon for a bride's family to go over every stitch of the bed curtains, the embroidery on the pillows, and the crispness of the linen sheets, as if this would ensure moral sanctity, or, at least, hygienic consummation. No pressure. Then you had the actresses involved, by which I mean the brides. Well trained in the fine art of fainting, sighing at appropriate intervals, and never expressing a concrete opinion unless prompted. For many, the wedding night arrived like a curtain call in a play they hadn't even rehearsed for. Enter, rather dramatically, the corset. Ah, the Victorian corset, cunningly engineered to hold in not only a woman's anatomy, but also any remaining hope of spontaneous passion. A wedding night often began with the husband fumbling, bravely, with dozens of hooks, laces, and moral implications. Husbands of the era were not known for their dexterity, either marital or manual. Undressing a Victorian bride was less like undressing a person and more like disassembling a clock, blindfolded, while being watched by your ancestors. And it wasn't just the corset. Beneath the layers of petticoats, chemises, bustles, and modesty panels lay a psychological, gauntlet of expectations and inhibition. Victorian literature often described female virtue as something delicate, always on the edge of ruin, like a sugar sculpture at a warm picnic. With that in mind, many brides took to the marital bed with the same enthusiasm one might expect from someone being asked to sit through a 5-hour opera about wallpaper. On the male side, let us not forget the helpful advice available to the Victorian groom, namely, none, unless he stumbled upon one of the more bracing medical treatises of the era or some alarmingly candid letters from his rakish cousin. He was likely in the dark. And the dark was precisely where much of the wedding night's mystery unfolded, or failed to. To complicate things further, some couples found themselves not in the plush privacy of a honeymoon suite, but in a family home, perhaps in the upstairs bedroom of the bride's parents' house. Victorian walls, despite their floral paper and layers of respectability, were thin, very thin. Few things are as effective in draining the passion from a situation as knowing that Aunt Mildred is in the next room with her ear pressed against the tea cabinet. It was a perfect storm of anticipation, confusion, and lace. For many couples, the first night was not so much a romantic eruption, but rather a truce. A tentative handshake between unfamiliar parties that said, "We don't know what we're doing either, but let's be civil about it." And for some brides, that first night was not even spent with their new husbands at all. There are charming records of brides sleeping beside their mothers, hand in hand, as if preserving maidenhood through sheer maternal proximity. Others confessed, in hushed letters, to delaying any business of intimacy for days, weeks, sometimes until they felt ready, or until their curiosity finally outgrew their terror. Still, amidst all this fumbling in the embroidered dark, some couples eventually found rhythm, humor, even a tenderness. It just didn't always happen on the first night, or the second. But long before they found their own rhythm, couples had to wade through the well-intended, though often misguided, advice books making the societal rounds. Yes, those charming little volumes that promised enlightenment and offered some truly creative definitions of the word. In a moment, we'll tiptoe into the curious world of Victorian marital manuals, those earnest tomes filled with bold assumptions, moral certitude, and some diagrams that are best not looked at before bed. By the time the bedroom doors finally creaked shut behind a Victorian newlywed couple, the rituals of courtship, chaperoned outings, cloying letters full of trembling affections, and family-approved cake tastings had all given way to a singular, unspoken dread. What now? For many brides, and not a few grooms, the wedding night was less a private celebration of love and more of a theatrical plunge into the unknown. Like an actor handed a script in ancient Greek 5 minutes before curtain. The comedy, as it often goes, lay in the fact that no one knew quite what to do, but everyone pretended that they did, or in many cases, hoped they wouldn't have to find out for at least another night. See, while Victorian society teetered delicately on the stiff upper lip of propriety, it was also profoundly terrified of the flesh. Sex, as a concept, was shrouded in uneasy mystery. Imagined as both vital and vaguely diabolical, the whole ordeal was coated with the moral varnish of medical warnings and religious sermons, which makes one wonder, were they trying to populate the empire or terrify it into priesthood? Medical journals of the time, written by men in rather serious beards, warned of everything from nervous collapse to weakened spinal fluids following the marital act. One popular 19th century text advised that consummation should occur only when absolutely necessary and certainly not more than once a week, which is, coincidentally, the same advice I give to my houseplants when I'm too tired to water them. Many women entered marriage with next to no understanding of what physical intimacy would actually entail. It wasn't uncommon for a mother to offer vague parting advice in the form of cryptic warnings. Bear what must be borne, darling, and never let him see your ankles before breakfast. At best, these departing words were metaphors cloaked in lace, and at worst, they were puzzles better suited for an Agatha Christie novel. Men, meanwhile, often embedded their expectations in rather lopsided education. Some turned to the grim delights of Victorian erotica, usually distributed under the counter of certain bookshops and held in the same section where mutton chop maintenance guides were sold. Others acquired their training via experiences in less savory establishments, leading to wildly imbalanced encounters in the marriage bed. These discrepancies did not lend themselves to harmony, or indeed to basic communication. Imagine, if you will, two people, both wearing corsets, because believe it or not, some gentlemen rather like the feel of a tight waistcoat, trying to unravel 3 days' worth of buttons and social embarrassment by gaslight. The blankets were heavy, the expectations were heavier, and the silence absolutely deafening. Except, of course, for the distant sound of a cuckoo clock announcing it was already awkward. For couples of higher station, servants were often lurking just beyond the door, ready to collect laundry or deliver a late-night bouillon, which meant that consummation might be shared, at least by ear, with the housemaid and the stable boy. Some brides feigned migraines, some grooms feigned sleep. A few, daring revolutionaries in their own way, simply used the time to compare literary tastes or discuss their weak opinions on Byron. Still, amidst all this farce and fumbling, something else was slowly brewing. There were doctors, reformers, and quiet rebels who began to propose a notion both radical and risque, that intimacy could be kind, that it might involve conversation, possibly even mutual enjoyment. Scandalous stuff. These ideas filtered into whispered advice, new pamphlets on marriage, and the rare hopeful sermon. It was the cusp of an awakening, still muffled by lace curtains and telegram etiquette, but flickering at the edges of the culture nonetheless. Of course, not every wedding night was a disaster. Some couples found laughter in their mutual confusion. Some found their stride after an awkward start involving a dropped candle or an overzealous bed canopy. And others simply ignored the pressure entirely, choosing instead to eat leftover cake while perched on matching velvet poufs, wondering why everyone got so worked up about it all. And so, while the Victorian wedding night was often haunted more by nerves than passion, also bore the early seeds of change, the notion that love might one day mean getting to know each other outside the rigid scripts. Now, if you're still awake, and it's quite all right if you're not, we'll gently wander next toward an even stranger invention of Victorian romance, the honeymoon. Spoiler alert, it involves geography, bath chairs, and, unexpectedly, Scotland. One might assume that by the late Victorian period, with its towers of etiquette books, libraries of sermons, and burgeoning industries devoted to lacy bedroom attire, the average wedding night might have become slightly less harrowing. But alas, in this twilight of a tightly corseted era, the average bride and groom were still navigating their first night of matrimony not with delight, but with a complex cocktail of dread, confusion, and, if they were very lucky, a dry biscuit and a cup of weak tea. In true Victorian fashion, ambiguity wasn't just a social preference, it was, practically, a national pastime. And nowhere did this enigmatic air hang more heavily than in the marriage bed, where euphemism ruled supreme. The word sex was about as welcome as a hen in a hat shop, and more often than not, the marital act was referred to in profoundly vague terms such as conjugal duty, wifely submission, or that perennial favorite, knowing one another, which sounds vaguely biblical until you realize that young people were often given so little detail that knowing could have reasonably been misinterpreted to include a lengthy game of charades or a firm handshake. To help maintain this fog of mystery, many Victorian women were deliberately taught as little as possible about what might occur after the vows. Some were told nothing at all, resulting in wedding night stories so magnificently awkward they could be bottled and sold as farce in 3 acts. There's one well-documented tale involving a newlywed bride who, upon being approached by her expectant husband, burst into tears, thinking he was trying to kill her. She locked herself in the bathroom and wouldn't emerge until her mother arrived the next morning with boiled eggs and a more thorough explanation. Meanwhile, their male counterparts weren't exactly masters of the marital arts either. Most of them had been handed one of two things: either a deeply unhelpful, alarmingly clinical medical pamphlet. The male member may cause fatigue or, in rare cases, morbidity, or terrifically bad advice from other equally uninformed men involving sheep, sailors, and scandalous French novels inevitably misread. Let's also consider that many of these couples had known each other in the Victorian fashion, which is to say, their courtship consisted of heavily chaperoned walks, brief exchanges at tea, and the occasional shared appreciation of a fern. They might have held hands once, through gloves. And now, suddenly, they found themselves alone in a room, wallpapered in roses, staring at a brass bed built more for antique grandeur and less for comfort, expected to perform a societal expectation they barely comprehended beneath layers of linen and repression. Even setting aside the psychological labyrinth, the physical aspects of wedding nights were no picnic either. The undergarments alone required a degree in mechanical engineering. Corsets were not exactly designed for swift removal, and some were so stiff with whalebone they may well have been considered light armor. Men, for their part, often struggled with the unfamiliar fastenings and petticoats, the unspoken Victorian equivalent of a boss-level puzzle. This was not the sleek, romantic elegance of modern cinema. It was more like trying to undress a fully prepared lasagna. And then there was the spectral presence of the medical community. Victorian doctors, ever eager to provide alarmist opinions on what they barely understood, had been warning women for decades that sexual activity could unleash a storm of ill health. Phrases like womb derangement, hysteria, and the always delightful spiral into madness were tossed about with alarming ease. For men, the warnings often focused on debilitating emissions and the dreaded specter of losing manly vigor, especially if they'd ever dared to self-indulge. Yes, even here, the specter of sin and sickness loomed larger than a taxidermy owl in your mother-in-law's parlor. But despite all this, despite fear, farce, and a nation determined to make every pleasurable thing sound like a misstep, some couples found their way through, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes tenderly, often with candlelight and confusion. And in odd pockets of the era, things began to shift. Writers started sneaking more constructive discussions into novels. Discreet guides for husbands began to circulate in small, discreet envelopes. Whispers of a more compassionate view of marriage. And even, dare we say, emotional intimacy began to bubble under the starched surface. Of course, it would take decades more to unravel the gowns, the gaps, and the guilt. But even among petticoats and prejudice, change always begins, however softly. So let us tiptoe gently now, past the whispering keyholes and into the slow-turning dawn of curiosity, empathy, and rather less terrifying wedding nights. By the time the moon peered over the soot-breathing chimneys of Victorian London, sending silvery warnings through fog-stained glass, the newlyweds had been officially deposited at the edge of their most mysterious terrain, the wedding night. Not the ceremony that had ended hours ago with a respectable jig and far too much boiled meat, but the grand finale feared by brides, fretted over by grooms, and spoken of only in euphemisms so densely packed you'd think the English language had choked on propriety itself. Now here they were, poor darlings, perched nervously in oversized four-poster, or beds that looked more like ecclesiastical monuments than pieces of furniture. Curtains closed, candles flickering anxiously, corsets unyielding, and the air dense with the unbreathable blend of lavender sachets and social panic. Victorian society, ever the dramatist, had conditioned its children to believe that modesty was next to moral sainthood, especially for women. A lady's innocence was so fiercely protected that many reached the altar with a grasp of human biology that wouldn't pass a quiz written by a well-informed goose. There were whispered warnings, of course. Older women with hawk-like eyes passed down vague advice wrapped in metaphor. Make yourself still as a cup of tea, and everything will be done before it cools. Comforting, Few, if any, Victorian girls were told what actually happened on a wedding night. Instead, they received embroidered handkerchiefs, little books with titles like The Duties of Marriage, and the occasional veiled warning that men had certain needs akin to thunderstorms, unpredictable and best waited out politely. Doctors, many of whom believed that female pleasure was either non-existent or dangerous, didn't help the matter. Tales spread in parlors and sewing circles about unlucky brides who, upon discovering the act itself, went into fits, fainted dead away, or developed what was ominously referred to as hysterics, which was less of a diagnosis and more of a catch-all for female discomfort or personality. And if you think the men fared any better in this tangled comedy, let's stroll gingerly into the minds of the Victorian groom, raised on a diet of Latin, cricket, and the firm belief that emotions were best expressed through the keen polishing of one's walking cane. These chaps were expected to know instinctively what to do. Most had never seen an ankle above the boot, let alone the full, corset-loosened reality of a wife attempting, with the delicacy of a bomb disposal expert, to shimmy out of 23 buttons sewn on by an ambitious seamstress. It didn't help that they were warned, sometimes by trembling clergy or suspiciously red-faced cousins, about the dangers of overenthusiasm, suggesting that if a man were to express himself too vigorously, he might lose all his aristocratic fortitude, grow hair in unfortunate places, or, in one pamphlet's rather panicked phrasing, evaporate the vital essence. Sounded like a great night ahead. Of course, not all was grim. Amidst the confusion and comedic blundering, there were moments of real connection, accidental tenderness, and shared absurdity. Many couples, once they'd tripped their way through the layers of silence and petticoats, found laughter on the other side. Some may even have figured out that desire doesn't always need diagrams to bloom. But even that took time. Night after night, some couples slept in separate beds, while quietly swapping nervous glances over the rim of bedtime. Cocoa. Victorian marriage wasn't so much a candlelit tango as it was an elaborate game of charades wearing 4 layers of starched linen. So what does it all mean? Why did a night meant for unity cause such dread? Perhaps because the Victorians, for all their empire-building and steam-powered optimism, feared the one domain they could neither tame nor label: emotion. Romance, when it crossed into the territories of skin and soul, didn't fit on their family crests, but under all that starch and etiquette was a yearning as old as poetry, to be known, to be held, to survive the awkwardness and find something tender in the muffled dark. And now, dear dreamer, as the gas lamps flicker low and the carriages creak off into the fog, let your mind wander gently from lace and lamplight, from fearful glances and half-whispered vows, and into that quiet place where even the stiffest collars fade away. Sleep well, with no corsets, no confusion, and absolutely no need to read the Duties of Marriage. You've had quite enough for one night.